If you're watching this, maybe you felt something isn't right about what you were taught. The stories don't add up. The history doesn't match. I've been there, and Spinoza gave me the answers. Stay with me to the end.
Stop believing Peter was chosen by Jesus to lead. He wasn't. James was. Spinoza proved it from documents the church has suppressed for 2,000 years, and there is evidence that Peter, or those around him, arranged what happened next. I want to present this to you clearly without ornament, because this is not the kind of argument that benefits from dramatic framing. The evidence is sufficient on its own. What I am going to show you today is a case, a documentary case, built from primary sources, using the method that Spinoza outlined in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. For the proposition that the Church's founding narrative about patrine succession is not what the documents show, and that the man who was actually designated to lead, and who actually led for 30 years, was removed from the founding narrative with a precision that is either remarkable coincidence or something else entirely. His name was James, James the Just, the brother of Jesus. And before I explain why the Church does not want you to think too carefully about him, I need to tell you what 3 independent sources confirm about his role. But before I get to those 3 documents, and I will get to them because what they show is in the Bible you probably own, you need to understand something about why the Church never mentions James in the same breath as Peter. Not once. Not from the pulpit. Not in the catechism. Not in the apostolic succession doctrine that runs through every denomination that traces its authority back to the 1st century. The omission is not accidental. It is structural. And it is Spinoza's method, the method of reading what institutions choose not to say as carefully as what they choose to say, that makes the omission visible. The first source is Acts of the Apostles. The second is Paul's letter to the Galatians. The third is the Gospel of Thomas, saying 12, which was buried in the Egyptian desert for 1,600 years and found in 1945 by a farmer digging for fertilizer in a field near Nag Hammadi. I will start with Acts, because Acts is in your Bible. It has always been in your Bible. And what Acts 15 shows, if you read it without the institutional filter that the tradition has placed over it, is so directly contrary to the doctrine of patrine primacy, that the fact it has survived in the canon at all is something of a monument to the Church's willingness to bet that most people never read carefully. In a few minutes, I am going to read you a sentence from the Gospel of Thomas, a text that was buried in Egypt for 1,600 years, a sentence where Jesus answers the question of succession directly. Keep that in mind. The Council of Jerusalem. The year is approximately 49 of the Common Era. The question before the council is one that had split the early Christian community along its deepest fault line. What requirements apply to Gentile converts? Paul and Barnabas had been conducting a mission in the Eastern Mediterranean, bringing non-Jews into the movement, and the circumcision party, Jewish Christians who maintained that the full requirements of Torah applied to everyone, had been following behind them, insisting that the Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and observe the Jewish law. The dispute had become acute enough that a council was convened in Jerusalem, the seat of authority. Peter speaks first, Acts 15:7-11. A reasonable speech about his experience with Gentile converts and the action of the Holy Spirit. The speech is recorded. Peter is present, and then James speaks. Now listen carefully, because this is where the institutional narrative quietly stops teaching. Acts 15:13. After they finished speaking, James replied. He does not second a motion. He does not support a previous speaker. He replies as the presiding authority responds to testimony presented before a decision. And then, Acts 15:19-20, therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God. My judgment, not our consensus, not the will of the Spirit as confirmed by multiple voices. My judgment. The judgment is James's. The decision belongs to James. Peter gave testimony. James ruled. What I'm about to read from Galatians, This is Paul writing it, not a critic of the church, should have changed Christian theology entirely. It didn't. And now that I've told you that, you need to hear it very carefully. Galatians 2:11-14. Paul is writing his own letter, the earliest stratum of New Testament text we possess, written within 20 years of the events, to a community Paul himself had founded, with no institutional reason to flatter Peter or James or anyone else in Jerusalem. Paul is reporting what happened at Antioch. Peter had been at Antioch. He had been eating with the Gentiles, sharing meals, the gesture of full inclusion in first-century Jewish social grammar. He had been doing this openly, without reservation. And then Paul writes, certain men came from James. That is the phrase. Not men who happened to be from Jerusalem, men from James. The delegation traveled with James's authority, and when they arrived, Peter withdrew. He separated himself from the Gentile table. He stopped eating with them. He performed observance for an audience that James's delegation represented. Paul confronted Peter publicly. And then Paul writes something that most translations soften considerably. The word he uses for what Peter was doing is hypocrisis, the Greek theatrical term for putting on a performance for an audience present. Peter had changed his behavior not because he had changed his theology, but because the people watching him had changed. Men came from James. Peter adjusted accordingly. That is the hierarchy, documented in Paul's own letter, preserved in the canon because removing it would have meant removing Paul. Peter backed down. Because men came from James. That is the first-century documentary record of the authority structure in the early church. Actually, before I read you what the Gospel of Thomas says, I want to tell you where I was when I first read this particular sentence, because the circumstances have stayed with me. It was the early 1990s. I had requested the Nag Hammadi Library, the James M. Robinson translation, the Brill Academic Edition, the kind of text that requires a reference slip and a weight and a seat at a narrow table in a reading room with high windows. The British Library reading room at that time had a quality of light I have not found anywhere else. Pale, very even, coming through windows high enough that you never quite saw the sky, just a gray diffusion that made everything look slightly preserved. There was a mug of tea on the table. It had been warm when the text arrived. It was not warm by the time I reached saying 12 of the Gospel of Thomas. I was reading Thomas for a different project, a question about the composition of the Nag Hammadi texts, about which of the sayings had pre-Gnostic origins, about the fragments that represented a tradition genuinely independent of the Synoptic Gospels. I was not looking for succession. I was not thinking about James. I had reached saying 12 in the ordinary sequence of the text, reading through, and I read it, and I put it down, and I read it again. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our teacher?" And Jesus said, "Wherever you are to go to James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Dissect with that. The tea was cold. The light was still that same flat gray. For whose sake heaven and earth came into being. That is not a modest commendation. That is the highest possible theological endorsement in the vocabulary available to the text. And the text was not a marginal fragment. It was a complete collection of sayings, part of a library of 52 texts, buried in the Egyptian desert. Buried, according to the scholarly consensus, sometime in the 4th century, when Athanasius of Alexandria issued his festal letter of 367 AD, ordering the destruction of non-canonical texts. Someone buried them, carefully, in sealed jars, in a field near a cliff face, and they were found 1600 years later by a man digging for fertilizer who did not know what he had found. That sentence was buried for 1600 years, and it directly answers the question the church has never allowed you to ask directly: did Jesus designate a successor? The Gospel of Thomas says yes, and the name is not Peter. So now you understand why James was the leader. That is clear. Acts confirms it. Galatians confirms it. Thomas confirms it. But here is what none of those documents explain. What happened to him? There is a passage in Eusebius, 4th century church father, the man who wrote the official history of Christianity, where he lists the bishops of Jerusalem. James is first on the list. I'll come back to what he does not say about that. Before that, I want to explain something about the man himself, because without understanding what kind of man James was, what Eisenman found in the Dead Sea Scrolls does not make sense. James the Just was known by that epithet, the Just, because of his reputation for strict Torah observance. Second-century sources describe him in terms that make him sound almost ascetic. He reportedly drank no wine, ate no meat, wore only linen, and spent so much time in the temple in prayer that his knees had developed calluses. Whether those details are literal or hagiographical, they represent a consistent portrait. A man deeply embedded in Jewish practice, in Jewish community, in the temple cult, in the observance of Torah, as the living covenant between the people and God. James was not moving Christianity away from its Jewish roots. James was its Jewish roots. Wait. Before I explain the Dead Sea Scrolls connection, I need to explain what kind of community produced those texts, because without that, the identification makes no sense. Robert Eisenman is a scholar at California State University, Long Beach. His 1997 work, James the Brother of Jesus, is one of the most contested and most consistently ignored books in 20th century biblical scholarship. I say most consistently ignored with some care. Ignored not because the arguments are easily refuted, but because the arguments, if correct, have implications for the institutional church, that the institutional church has a strong interest in not examining publicly. Eisenman's argument, which I am presenting here as a scholarly hypothesis with substantial documentary support, rather than as established fact, is that the teacher of righteousness described in the Dead Sea Scrolls is James the Just. The community at Qumran, the community that produced and preserved the scrolls, was intensely Torah observant, deeply opposed to the corruption of the Jerusalem temple priesthood, and organized around a charismatic teacher whose righteousness and persecution are described across multiple scroll texts with great specificity. The parallels to what the sources say about James are not vague. They are structural. The same pattern of leadership, the same quality of strict observance, the same antagonism with the temple establishment, the same persecution by a priestly authority figure whom the scrolls call the wicked priest. Eisenman identifies the wicked priest with Ananus ben Ananus, the high priest who will appear again very shortly in a story about the year 62 AD and a judicial procedure conducted in a specific 2-week window. Eisenman is contested. I want to be clear about that. The scholarly consensus has not accepted his identification, but the scholarly consensus has also not refuted the documentary parallels. It has largely declined to engage with them, which is its own kind of answer. 3 things about James's execution in 62 AD don't add up. I'll give you the first 2 now. The third one, the one Spinoza spent the most time on, comes after we understand who gave the order. Festus was the Roman governor of Judea. He died in office in 62 AD. His successor, Albinus, was appointed in Rome and had to travel to the region, a journey that in the logistics of the Roman administrative system took several weeks. The window between Festus's death and Albinus's arrival was approximately 2 to 4 weeks. It was a window in which there was no Roman oversight of judicial proceedings, no governor to review capital sentences, no imperial authority to defer to. Ananus ben Ananus, who had been appointed high priest, convened an ad hoc Sanhedrin in that window. He brought charges against James. Transgression of the law is the formulation preserved in the sources. The ad hoc Sanhedrin convicted. James was killed, stoned according to some sources, thrown from a height according to others. The details vary. The timing does not. The judicial proceeding was conducted in the precise window in which Roman oversight was absent. 2 to 4 weeks. That is the first thing that does not add up. The evidence I'm about to present about James's death is not conspiracy. It is public record. The question is why it has never been taught as such. The second thing that does not add up is the reaction. The first-century Jewish historian who recorded James's death in his Antiquities was not a Christian source. He had no interest in making James a martyr or Ananus a villain, and yet his account records that citizens of Jerusalem, and he uses a specific phrase, The most equitable of the inhabitants of the city, or fair-minded citizens in some translations, were so disturbed by the proceedings that they took action. They did not simply protest. They traveled to meet Albinus as he was arriving, to inform him of what had happened and to complain about it. Albinus, upon receiving this information, was furious. He wrote to Ananus expressing his anger, and Ananus was subsequently deposed. A Roman governor arrived in Judea, was informed of what Ananus had done, and had him removed from office. The most equitable citizens of Jerusalem had found the proceedings sufficiently unjust that they risked the journey to intercept a new Roman governor and file a formal complaint. That is the second thing that does not add up. The reaction from non-Christian sources was outrage, not grudging acceptance, not the quiet passage of a routine judicial procedure. Outrage. Before I give you Spinoza's actual conclusion about Peter, I want to acknowledge something honestly. I was preparing a lecture. This was in the late 1980s, sometime in the second half of a decade I spent teaching in Norwich, on apostolic succession. I had taught the subject many times. It was a standard component of the curriculum in theology and philosophy of religion, and I had a set of notes that I updated periodically, and a sense of the material that felt settled and familiar. I was sitting at my desk in the evening with my notes and the relevant primary sources spread out in front of me, and I was rereading Acts 15 to refresh my preparation. And I stopped. I had been teaching around it. For years, I had been teaching apostolic succession by describing Peter as the central figure of the Jerusalem Council, as the voice of authority in the Acts narrative, as the natural first among equals. And I had been doing this while Acts 15:19 was sitting in my notes with the words, "My judgment is," highlighted in a color I had chosen, I could not have told you when, that I now associated with important passages. James's judgment. My notes said Peter was the authority. The highlighted text said, "My judgment is," and the speaker was James. I did not have a dramatic moment. There was no revelation. What I had was the particular exhaustion of recognizing a pattern I had been avoiding, not consciously avoiding, but the kind of avoidance that becomes habitual when the alternative requires revising a large amount of work that has served you adequately for a long time. Like a drawer that has never quite closed properly. You stop noticing it, you stop trying, you work around it. And then one evening, you notice it again, and you admit to yourself quietly in the dark outside the lamp's circle of light that it was never going to close. Not with the notes you had, not with the framework you had been given. I revised the lecture. I did not announce to my students that I had been teaching around a primary source for several years. I simply taught it differently, with the primary source present. The Church celebrates Peter as the rock. The Church acknowledges in its own records that James was the first bishop of Jerusalem. These two facts cannot both be true without an explanation the Church has never provided. Eusebius, Historia Ecclesiastica, Book 2, Chapter 23. The passage describing James's death via Hegesippus, a 2nd century writer whose work has not survived except in quotations. The passage is remarkable not for what it says, but for what it does not say. Eusebius is capable of elaborate rhetorical commemoration. His accounts of the deaths of the martyrs are written with the language of sacrifice and triumph, of a death that confirms faith and demonstrates the power of the Spirit. His account of James is not like that. It is factual, clinical, detailed in the particulars of what happened, the sequence of events, the location, the charges, the procedure, and almost completely absent of the liturgical register that characterizes his accounts of other significant deaths in the early church. The absence of that register is what matters. Hold on. Before I read you what Spinoza actually wrote about Matthew 16, let me ask you something. Why did the Church preserve Eusebius's list of bishops of Jerusalem, which begins with James? Why did the Church preserve Acts 15:19 with James's "My judgment is"? Why did the Church preserve Galatians 2:11-14 with Paul's account of Peter backing down when men came from James? These texts were not hidden. They were copied and distributed and read across 2,000 years of institutional Christianity. The institutional church made a choice, the choice Spinoza identified in his method, not to suppress the documents, but to manage the interpretation, to ensure that these passages were always read within a framework that prevented the reader from assembling them into the argument they collectively make. The argument that James was the leader, that Peter was subordinate to James, that Jesus had named James, in a text now known as the Gospel of Thomas, as the one for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. The framework held for 2,000 years. It holds because it is taught before the texts are read, because the institutional interpretation arrives before the primary sources do, because Sunday school comes before Acts 15, and by the time you read Acts 15, you read it through the Sunday school. Spinoza's conclusion, and I am drawing here from the method of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus applied to this specific case, not from a passage where Spinoza addresses James directly, because Spinoza did not, is that Matthew 16:18 represents what he would call retroactive institutional legitimization. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. That sentence, written in Greek, in a gospel composed several decades after the events it describes, at a period when the Roman Church was in the process of consolidating its claim to Petrine authority, carries the full weight of an institution writing its own founding document. It is not a record of what Jesus said. It is a record of what the institution needed Jesus to have said, at the point in history when the institution needed that mandate established in writing. Spinoza did not say Peter killed James. I am not saying that either. I want to be very careful about what the evidence shows and what it does not show. What the evidence shows is this: James was designated by Jesus, confirmed in leadership by Acts and Galatians, operating as the presiding authority of the Jerusalem community for 30 years after the crucifixion, and found by Robert Eisenman's reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls to be the most plausible identification for the teacher of righteousness, around whom a major Jewish community organized its entire religious life. James was executed in a 2 to 4 week judicial window that required precise timing to exploit the absence of Roman oversight. The most fair-minded citizens of Jerusalem found the execution sufficiently unjust to intercept the incoming governor. The contemporary record notes it was judicial murder. Eusebius noted it with unusual restraint, as if unsure how to commemorate a death that should have been commemorated loudly and was not. And within a decade of James's death, the movement he led in Jerusalem, Torah observant, deeply Jewish, organized around the temple and its community, ceased to be the dominant form of Christianity. The form that replaced it was Pauline, Gentile, Rome-oriented, disconnected from Torah, perfectly suited to imperial adoption 3 centuries later. Who benefited? Not a conspiratorial question, a historical one. The same question Spinoza applied to every institutional narrative he examined. When a document serves a power structure that did not exist when the document was written, the document requires examination. When a death conveniently removes the last obstacle to a different form of Christianity becoming dominant, the death requires examination. James's absence from the founding narrative of Christianity is not an accident of history. It is a decision. Someone, many someones across many generations, in many institutional contexts, decided that the figure who presided over the Jerusalem Council, the figure who gave Paul the authority to teach, the figure to whom Peter deferred, the figure who Jesus named in a text now recognized by every serious scholar of early Christianity, that this figure would not appear in the story Christians were taught about their own origins. The story that was taught instead is the one built on Matthew 16:18. On a sentence written in Greek, in a gospel produced decades after the events, at a moment when the Roman Church needed a founding document, and the man best placed to legitimate it, James, the brother of Jesus, the first bishop of Jerusalem, the figure all 3 independent sources confirm as leader, had been dead for long enough that the story could be arranged differently. If James had not been killed in 62 AD, if the 2 to 4 week window had not been exploited, if Ananus had not convened his ad hoc Sanhedrin, if the teacher of righteousness had continued to lead the Jerusalem community through the destruction of the temple and beyond, what form would Christianity have taken? Would it have remained deeply Jewish, Torah observant, connected to its Semitic roots? Would there have been a Council of Nicaea, A Holy Roman Empire? A papacy? A Protestant Reformation? I do not know. I do not think anyone can know. The counter-history is interesting, but ultimately unanswerable. What is not unanswerable is the question of what the documents show. They show James, they show him designated, leading, ruling. They show him killed in circumstances that still, 2,000 years later, do not add up. And they show the institution that replaced his movement building its authority on the name of a different man. The man who backed down when James's delegation arrived. The man Peter named as a foundation stone decades after the fact, in a language James never spoke. This is not about Peter. This is about who controls the narrative of Jesus. It always has been. The answer was in the documents all along. The church kept the documents. What the church did not keep was the instruction to read them together sequentially, without the interpretive frame arriving first. That is the only thing that was suppressed. Not the texts, the method. The Spinozist method of reading what is there, without the institutional tradition telling you what you are supposed to find. Read Acts 15, read Galatians 2, find the Gospel of Thomas. It is freely available. It has been translated and published in academic editions since the 1960s, and read Saying 12. And then ask yourself the question that every serious scholar apparently already knows the answer to, and has decided not to say from a pulpit. Who was chosen? The documents know. They have always known. They were just waiting for someone to read them the way Spinoza read everything, which is carefully, without assuming the tradition has already told you what the text says.
That's what Spinoza discovered. And now you know too. Stay curious, question everything. See you in the next one.